Hello, and welcome to the 91st episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest to the show, Rabbi Ezra Goldschmiedt. And Rabbi Goldschmiedt, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. All right, before we get started, actually, we are drinking this evening. Rabbi Goldschmiedt, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking wine. You will have to remind me what exact wine I'm having.
I believe it is a Cabernet Sauvignon or Sauvignon Blanc, one of the two, from Dalton. And I have, as we'll see, is actually quite fitting. So I'm drinking a Baltic Porter from Zwicz. I've never heard of it. It's here for those watching. But very pertinently to our considerations, it was actually brewed in Poland. So that's a nice little tease for what's to come. For those less familiar here with Rabbi Goldschmiedt, first of all, he received his rabbinic ordination from Yeshiva University, as well as a master's degree in Jewish education there. And in addition to his educational background, he presently serves as the rabbi of my synagogue, Sha'arei Torah, right here in the Queen City of the West, Cincinnati. And yes, and I'm not the only rabbi who serves as a congregant. He has no easy job having multiple rabbis in the congregation, right?
I think it's more intimidating the academic scholars of Judaism more than rabbis.
It's definitely a challenging mix.
It's a challenging mix.
It's a challenging mix.
You have to know what you're talking about, because they'll call you on it.
Keep you on your feet. Okay, great. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited to have him here. Welcome to my show, the Jewish Drinking Show. So welcome, Rabbi Goldschmiedt.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
Okay, so what are we actually talking about tonight? There is a mitzvah. We're talking about a mitzvah here, actually. There's a mitzvah deriving from Leviticus 23:14 against eating new grains. And it also, for those keeping score at home, also appears in the set table, the Shulhan Arukh, in section 293 in Yoreh Deah, which, as one can imagine, as we'll see, creates an interesting challenge for certain harvesting and, yes, fermenting and drinking beer. So as such, there is a halachic text that asserts that beer is the life of man. How did we get to such an assertion? So first of all, let's talk about this. So there is this biblical mitzvah, Rabbi Goldschmiedt, called Hadash, which literally translates to new, but there's a problem with consuming new grain. So Rabbi Goldschmiedt, what exactly is this? What's the background on it? And for those of us, many people, I'm sure, many listeners have never even heard of this special mitzvah.
So Hadash is a mitzvah that, like you mentioned, we cannot consume new grain. New is not defined as grain that, covered any specific span of time. More specifically, it is grain that has not been in existence, or if you want to get really precise in your definition, grain that had not yet taken root prior to when the Korban Omer, the Omer offering on the second day of Pesach, would be brought. If the grain only came in existence since after the bringing of that offering, the Omer, then it is new grain. It does not become old grain permitted for consumption until after the next year's Omer is brought.
For that second day of Passover.
The second day of Passover.
So we're springtime.
Right.
And that's very important.
Sure.
Second day of Passover in the springtime. So, okay.
Notably, we don't have a temple these days. There is no Korban Omer at all. The conclusion, therefore, is not, well, I guess we're never eating grain again. But instead, the technical understanding of the biblical law is when the day that the Omer would have been brought begins, that's when we can now consider all grain that was previously new as becoming yashan, becoming old. But rabbinically, we have an additional element of distance, is that we will wait until the completion of that day. And if you live outside of Israel, so that's one additional day, because for us, maybe the third day of Pesach is considered the second day of Pesach. In any event, for us living here in Cincinnati, our new grain becomes old grain from our perspective at the end of the 17th day of Nisan.
Right, so for the grain, so what grain is under consideration specifically?
All the 5 grains. So
and also when, from harvested or planted when?
So as long as it took root prior to that time, that will be when we consider it as grain which has made the transition to yashan, to old grain that's permitted.
So if theoretically someone planted grain May 2020, they could not have it until the spring of 2021, theoretically.
Until whenever the second day of Pesach is, yes.
Right, okay. That is important for us. Okay. Now, there is it's framing in the Shulhan Arukh. So that's sort of the broad general background. In the Shulhan Arukh, it gets brought up. Now, for those less familiar, the Shulhan Arukh, or literally the set table by Rabbi Yosef Karo, a 16th century work, is, so Rabbi Karo was writing, let's just say closer to the equator, as one might, but there were some interesting glosses thereupon, written by Rabbi Moses Isserles, who was writing in Krakow, Poland, and he had some interesting words about it, right? Maybe some leniency about it.
Yeah, sure. And you want me to elaborate on
yes,
that?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
so what do Rabbi Isserles have to say in Krakow?
So Rabbi Isserles has one of the major grounds for lenient consideration with respect to this law is he says that we do not have to worry about it. He considers it what we call a sveka, a matter of a doubt piled on top of another doubt. And in those scenarios, even if you're dealing with a biblical prohibition, if that's what's in question, when you add two different layers of doubt, one can be lenient, and he thinks that's operative in this case. And he says, interestingly enough, one might ask, like Rabbi Akiva Eger does, why is this considered two separate doubts? But the way the Ramah presents it is as such. It says, one doubt is, maybe the grain that you're purchasing is actually grain from last year's crop, which is for sure yashan, it's for sure old grain, it's for sure permitted. Mm-hmm. And then, even if it's from this year's batch, maybe it's from this year's batch that was, the kind that took root prior to the second day of Pesach, in which case it might be yashan on those grounds alone. So you put those two elements, two different reasons to suggest why it's yashan, we could assume it is yashan. You don't have to worry, you don't have to be concerned that maybe it's from the new crop. Some ask, why is that considered a doubled layer of doubt? Really, it's one question, really. Mm-hmm. Did this take root prior to the second day of this year's Pesach or not? But at least the Ramah presents it as sveka, as a double doubt.
Okay, so we have that double doubt from Rabbi Moses Isserles in the 16th century in Krakow, and but we have some comments, right? There's commentary. We never just have one set text. We have what to comment about, right?
You should know, by the way, before we go any further.
Yeah.
So there are certain Jews that certainly observe Hadash nowadays. We'll talk about that.
Outside of the land of Israel.
Correct, even outside the land of Israel.
Right.
And the observance of what we call yashan, the permitted old grain. That's how people call it, like, do you keep yashan? So that actually has Cincinnati roots as to how people in the United States observe yashan these days.
What's the Cincinnati connection?
So there is a woman who lived here up until a few years ago named Chasia Katriella Eshkol, who has done the majority of the work of doing research about products that you can find on your grocery shelves to tell you what is for sure yashan, what might be, what depends. Tell me the barcode, I can identify it based on that. She wrote a book called Vintage Grain about how you can, research this kind of stuff on your own. You could browse your own products in the grocery store, in your pantry.
Wow.
And she has a website called yashan.com.
Still exists?
Still exists.
Wow.
She used to live here in Cincinnati, just recently got married and moved to Arizona, I think.
Mazel tov.
And I believe Rabbi Weinrib is the rabbinic consultant. Rabbi Weinrib, my colleague in Cincinnati, has been the consultant for yashan.com, and I imagine he still is, for how yashan is observed by many Jews in America today.
That's really exciting. Awesome.
And it is something that some particularly scrupulous individuals keep. I have a story about a certain rabbi. He doesn't want to, as the story will indicate, he doesn't really
want his name to be known.
So one time, his son, who I had a relationship with in the past, told me one time he catches his father browsing the pantry with a list, a piece of paper. It says, "Dad, are you keeping yashan?" He's like, "Maybe." So he was keeping that as a strict measure upon himself and not on others. And he was caught in the act, so to speak.
Caught in the act of strictness. Okay. Alrighty. So now all this background, this is prologue for our conversation about how I mentioned how is beer the life of man. So the connection actually is to a particular Polish rabbi, Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, who, and for those less familiar with Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, so he was born in 1586 and died in 1667. And more significantly, that's nice to know different rabbis. Rabbis are great, and when they lived and where they lived. But to bring it to our pertinent conversation, the work we are referencing of his is his Turei Zahav Gold Rose And fun little fact, the only book of his that was published during his lifetime, it was actually the first printing of which was in 1646 in Lublin. And for those curious, as he mentions in his introduction, why did he choose the name Gold Rose, Turei Zahav? It was his hope that the Turim of the Arba Turim, which was an earlier work upon, he was commenting on the Shulhan Arukh, which was sort of a redux of sorts, a summarization of that, would now be clarified and elucidated by one whose name, David, is the numerical equivalent of the word Zahav, gold. Okay, cute little background. But now with all that background, the particular writing that we are discussing of Rabbi Segal's is found in Yoreh Deah 293-4, in which he deals with this topic. So for those looking to keep score at home, this is found in Turei Zahav, Yoreh Deah 293-4. So now, with all that background, we're getting to Rabbi Segal here. The TaZ, if we wanted to be into our acronyms. So for those who love their acronyms, who love nicknames. So Rabbi David HaLevi Segal. So what are, Rabbi Goldschmiedt, what are Rabbi David HaLevi Segal's arguments in dealing with the challenge of the prohibition of Hadash, this mitzvah against eating new grains in Poland?
Well, specifically, he talks about the Ramah, who, again, like you mentioned, is also from Poland. Mm-hmm. The Ramah's comments are a little bit more than just, we have a sveka, double doubt. He also talks about how, let's say you have certain crops that you're fairly certain are not yashan, that they are chadash, so for which this leniency that he mentioned will not apply. Mm-hmm. And I should point out, by the way, nowadays, the Ramah's logic is not going to apply anywhere near as much for us. We might not be interested in finding out this information, but as I mentioned to you before, there's ways you can look at barcodes and information. Like you can find out nowadays.
There's a lot more certainty. There's a lot more certainty of knowledge.
Where your grain came from, what crop it was, when it was harvested, all these kinds of things. You and I could find that out nowadays. So the matter of doubt is less relevant to us. Mm-hmm. But even in his time, certain grains apparently were not. So the Ramah says, with respect to those that are not careful about this, don't tell them. Yeah. And he invokes a principle called mutav yushagugin vayu mezidin. Better they do this in violation by accident rather than on purpose. Mm-hmm. So that is something which we don't always apply. It's a very difficult principle to use in many a circumstance. We don't generally like to keep people ignorant.
Well, okay, so one place, it probably appears other times in the Talmud, and this is a drinking-related appearance in the Talmud, where it talks about those, actually specifies women, who eat, and you guessed it, drink, on Erev Yom Kippur, all the way up until the time that we should probably really start not be drinking or eating, for that matter. I'm very drinking focused. So that is a drinking, Talmudic text.
I never thought of it as an alcoholic drinking.
It's drinking, any type of drinking. It's drinking. It's drinking. Why do we have to restrict ourselves to alcohol?
Sure. Okay.
I want to be a little more liberal about my drinking.
I would not recommend high consumption of alcohol prior to Yom Kippur.
Right. So for those, right, that's a whole separate conversation. Are you allowed to have? Most people say the final meal before Yom Kippur shouldn't have any alcohol, but can you have Erev Yom Kippur alcohol? You can't have it Erev Tish B'Av, which is another major fast day. Anyways, so that is a drinking text, and the rabbis say, should we bother ourselves with these women who are eating and drinking all the way up until Erev Yom Kippur? And they say, no, it's better that they should be, not knowledgeably, transgressing, and better that they should be just, kept in the dark a little bit.
They wouldn't be eating and drinking on Yom Kippur itself, but they would take it really down to the last moment.
Up until
when there was and there is still a mitzvah, what we call Tosefet Yom Kippur, that you should be adding somewhat of the ordinary day prior to. Right. Some of its holy, some of its mundane nature should be, made holy and like Yom Kippur, at least a few minutes before.
Right. So that is a connection to a Talmudic drinking text. Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics, as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
This is not a principle that we just
always apply,
lightly,
right?
And the TaZ is less comfortable with doing that, especially because he notes there's plenty of people who certainly do know better. They're aware of this prohibition of Hadash, and I'm seeing them eating grain without any heed paid.
Ramah or TaZ?
The TaZ. The
Okay,
TaZ says this.
so I have to point out, I love this. This is one of his opening lines, and he's really responding, and again, he's responding to Rabbi Ezra, who lived in the exact same country, Poland, 1 century prior. He says, look, what do you mean not telling people? He says, we actually see sages in Israel who are not doing this. They're not careful, right? And it's not like 1 year. Never. Doesn't matter the year. They're not careful about this. So we can't use this term because they're chachamim. They're sages. They are actually knowledgeable about this. It's one thing not to tell the Polish farmers,
uneducated masses.
Right, the uneducated, the unwashed masses, like the hoi polloi. Yeah, okay, fine. But now we're talking about Chachmei Yisrael. We're talking about Jewish sages, people who are clearly learned. They are aware of this prohibition, and yet they themselves are not careful about this. So we can't use this principle that Rabbi Isserles brings up.
Right. So he feels the need to give some, what we'd call a lechatchila, an a priori justification for why Hadash can be consumed. The route that he takes is, if he goes back to the original Talmudic sources, it's not so clear that we will apply this prohibition to grain that's grown outside the land of Israel.
Well, so to pick up what you're saying, there's a doubtfulness aspect. You mentioned earlier, Rabbi Ezra mentioned the sveka, sort of a doubt built upon a doubt. And here he's introducing a totally different directionality of doubt.
Correct, meaning the Ramah was about, is this grain that is old or new? The TaZ is going to say, I'll tell you, the grain that you and I are consuming is never subject to this prohibition in the first place. Right? It's something which is grain grown outside the land of Israel, and this rule doesn't apply to it. It'll be like other agricultural mitzvot of the land of Israel. It's only for that stuff, and that's it. Now, he does acknowledge that that's not agreed upon by, so to speak, the heavy hitters, the major foundational works upon which Shulhan Arukh is based. Right? Rabbi Yosef Karo in his Shulhan Arukh tells you in his introduction, he says, I'm going to be primarily basing my conclusions based on what the big three say. And if there's any disagreement, I'll go at it with 2 out of 3 between the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh.
It's exactly like Minority Report.
How so?
Well, they went with 2 out of the 3 precogs in that movie.
It is a great movie.
Yeah. So it's the same idea, and then also there's a midrash about totally very, very different, but also when they found the different Sifrei Torah in the temple, and they found them, and there were some differences, and they went with 2 out of 3. They went with the majority. Yeah.
So, but this is not one of those that even has that kind of gray. Sometimes when the Ramah is more lenient, you'll see, he's following the Rosh primarily. Even though the Beit Yosef only counts him as one of the 3, the Ramah will give him greater credence, let's say. Here all 3 of them say, like what the Shulchan Arukh does, like what the Ramah assumes, that Hadash is a prohibition that applies to even produce growing outside the land of Israel. It's just that there's other grounds for leniency if you're going to move beyond those 3 commentaries.
Yeah. And so he actually digs more deeply. He goes all the way back to Talmudic sources.
Right.
And I will point out, the debate on this is no one's talking about the land of Israel. Land of Israel is outside of the it's outside of debate. Everybody agrees this still it's still in operation, as it were, in the land of Israel. But when it comes to diasporic Jews and this agricultural mitzvah, well, we take it back to the Talmud.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, there's a misconception a lot of people have out there. They assume that, let's say I'm an American, I keep, so to speak, mainstream kashrut in terms of which authorities, which certifying agencies I follow, which ones I bring into my house, let's say. And they have a misconception that they think the Israeli rabbinate standard of kashrut is something which is more lenient than they're used to here in America. It's not entirely true. In certain areas they are more lenient, in certain areas they're more strict. This is one of them. It's somewhat circumstantial, is that everyone agrees this prohibition applies to produce grown in the land of Israel. But that's something that the Israeli rabbinate has to be very particular about, even though mainstream kashrut organizations here are much more flexible about it. But that's a function of us being outside the land of Israel, unfortunately.
Yeah. So a quick synopsis, as it were, about this. So in the Talmud, there is an opinion that Hadash, this mitzvah against eating this new grain after before a certain time, there's an opinion that says that's only for the land of Israel, and there's another that says no, even beyond the land of Israel.
if you want to go even earlier, so in the actual verses in Chumash, in the Torah, where it describes this prohibition, it describes the prohibition of Hadash as being b'chol moshvotechem, in all of your dwelling places. If you and I were to read that, we'd probably assume that means, yep, I guess it applies everywhere.
Right.
But in
like Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud.
Right. Rabbi Eliezer in the Talmud, he thinks so. That's just what it means.
Takes it very literally.
But then in that Mishnah in Kiddushin that you're quoting right now, where Rabbi Eliezer thinks that's what it means, what we call the Tanakama, the first unnamed approach to this issue, and we usually assume that reflects the majority opinion, the view of the masses of rabbis, and not just this individual Rabbi Eliezer. So they assume that b'chol moshvotechem means something else. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it is only upon settlement of the land of Israel.
Yeah, right? Yerusha v'yeshiva davka, where it has to actually be settled.
Right.
The moshvotechem, where is this yeshiva? Actually, specifically in the dwelling of the land.
And that phrasing indicates when does this mitzvah kick in, so to speak. It's once the Jews settle the land of Israel. But it's not to say that in dwelling places outside the land of Israel you have to keep this. Right. So that's how the Tanakhama understands it. And if we were to end there, we would say very clearly Hadash doesn't apply outside the land of Israel. We have a principle called Yachid Barabim Halacha Karabim. When you have a debate between the majority versus a minority view, that's what you have here. Rabbis at large, Tanakhama, versus Rabbi Eliezer, just one solitary rabbi. So we should follow their view, and we should say, we don't have to worry about this outside the land of Israel. If you were to end there, that's it.
And Rabbi Eliezer is one of the top 10 most quoted rabbis in the Mishnah, at least by name. So he often is against the majority. And then, as you mentioned, subsequently, in the subsequent generation, in the generation right after Rabbi Eliezer, we have two other rabbis who disagree about this, Rabbis Akiva and Yishmael, who often themselves are disagreeing with each other.
So if you were to end there, though, as heavy as a hitter as Rabbi Eliezer is, he's got the majority overruling him. True. But there is another Mishnah, it's a Mishnah in Orla, I believe, that presents Rabbi Eliezer's view that Hadash applies outside the land of Israel plainly, without any dissent. It doesn't even quote Rabbi Eliezer, it just says it, what we call stam, unattributed, which means it reflects the majority view as well. So there you have a different principle in action, is that the halacha kistam mishnah, the law is supposed to follow any mishnah that presents a halachic ruling plainly. So we got two mishnayot that go against each other with principles that we're usually familiar with. And then what do you do with that is the big question. So the way that Shulhan Arukh took it, the way the three commentaries the Shulhan Arukh's based on took it, is we're going to run with the Stam Mishnah. We're going to run with the Mishnah in Orla that just plainly says Hadash applies to us, even our grain grown outside the land of Israel. And the TaZ is the one who comes in and says, hold on a second, maybe not. Maybe I should run with the other Mishnah instead. And it might depend to some degree, the TaZ says, on the historicity of when these Mishnayot developed.
What was taught first, what came first, right?
Right, meaning if the Mishnah in Arla that presents things plainly is the one that came first, and then later on you have another Mishnah that presents it as a debate, with a majority saying Hadash doesn't apply to us. So then when we have a machloket after a stam, when you have a debate after a previous Mishnah presents it plainly, we're going to run with the second Mishnah as being the more authoritative source, which would mean you could assume that everything's fine for us, like we said. But it's not so clear as to what came first or second. Whatever your standard issue order of the Masechtot in the Talmud are, that does not reflect necessarily the order in which these things were learned in the academies in which they were published, and for that reason we're kind of stuck. But the TaZ wants to say...
It's also fascinating. He's even attempting a sort of hierarchy of chronology. Like what came first, as opposed to saying like the Mishnah is was published as a text, whether it was orally published, textually printed, whatever it was. But it's interesting. He's trying to work through the chronology of that.
Right.
I hope you've been enjoying this episode so far with Rabbi Goldschmiedt. We still have more, but I want to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Adam Montefiore on the modern history of Israeli wines. Here we go. Here's a sneak peek.
Shemitah was the problem. And
we're in another Shemitah year right now.
We're in another Shemitah year right now.
Yeah.
So the big debate was what to do. So the more religious...
I was going to say that was 19 Shemitah cycles ago.
It was 88, 89.
Right. So so that was exactly 19. Because 20, it would have been 20 cycles ago that they founded the winery, 140 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need a calculator to do things like that. You can do it in your head.
Yeah. So 19 Shemitah cycles ago for those keeping score at home. Okay.
And it nearly tore the whole the first Aliyah apart.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Adam Montefiore on a modern history of Israeli wine. I hope you come back for that episode. Now back into this episode with Rabbi Goldschmiedt.
In addition to that, he says, we have a concept that in general, and we can do this even with a minority opinion, is we can follow a minority opinion when what we call a shat hadachak. In the best translation of this is pressing circumstances. In situations where it's very hard to follow even what we consider the mainstream psak, halachic ruling. In situations like that, to rely on a minority view after the fact or just in a difficult situation is something acceptable. And the TaZ says, I'll do you one better here. This is not us doing what, like I just mentioned, there are sources for following a minority view in a case of need. We're following a majority view. We're following, again, that Tanakama, the masses that are against Rabbi Eliezer. And we're doing it in a situation of pressing need. It is, in his time at least, as he describes, and this is, I think, the main takeaway that you want to get to is...
Wait, before you even get there, I do want to say what I think contributes to some potential lack of clarity exactly which way it should be decided. I mentioned that there was that plain teaching and Rabbi Eliezer. In the subsequent generation following Rabbi Eliezer, we have Rabbis Akiva and Ishmael who are arguing, and they take sides. And we might decide normally one way or over the other, and yet there is the potential that there might have been a scribal issue, and it could have actually been the flip-flop. And so it's not really even clear which way we should necessarily decide. So it's sort of left up in the air. Right. And so that's another piece of doubt introduced into this conversation.
Sure. Right. In terms of if you have an approach as to what to do with Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Yishmael, who have this debate later on.
Yep.
But we don't know who said what.
Right.
So then that leaves another issue that is unresolved.
Right. So that would, for those keeping score at home, early 2nd century rabbis Akiva and Ishmael, and we don't know which one is which. Which one said, I like the plain teaching, I like Rabbi Eliezer. It's left up for a matter of debate. So it's sort of up in the air, and he says we need to pick a side here.
Right.
Because we have a pressing concern.
Yeah. Now the Shulhan Arukh said what it said, but the TaZ says in our world at least, where it's very difficult to observe the mitzvah of Hadash properly, we are going to rely on the more lenient view. We're going to rely on the assumption that the Tanakama in that Mishnah in Kiddushin is correct. It doesn't apply to us. It doesn't apply to produce grown outside the land of Israel, and that's how we can manage without this.
Okay, so I'm just going to spill the beans. So the key line here, like literally the middle of this entire thing. I mean, this is the crux. This is the juicy middle of this writing. He says, look, we need to say that in our countries, and obviously he's in Poland and probably surrounding areas, in our countries, it is, as Rabbi Goldschmiedt mentioned, it's a shas hadachak. It's a pressing hour. It's there's something compelling us to move in a particular direction, and the language of his dechayv shal adam talui b'shtias shechar sa'orim uv'shibulat shual. So the thing that's pressing us to move in a really particular direction is because the life of man is dependent. I'm not making this up. I'm not putting words in his pen. The life of man is dependent on the drinking of beer of a variety of grains. Right? Grain-based beer, and I do have in my hand beer of grains brewed in the same country as Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, and for fun, also Rabbi Ezra as well. So this is really, I mean, this is the crux. This is literally the crux of his writing here. This is the value that he's asserting.
A lot of people read this and they assume, like, what kind of hedonist is this guy? He's got to drink beer. And they assume that the TaZ relates to beer in the same way that you and I relate to beer.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's so many things. Can I interject? So I'm just going to interject. This is not the only time the TaZ writes about beer. Okay. It's just not. Now, hedonist, I don't know if I would say hedonist.
No, so I can give you a better explanation that doesn't really entail.
Okay, sure. I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
I don't know so much about the historicity of this. You're going to, I'm sure, weigh in. But there were definitely times in world history where beer was considered the drink. Might have been a lot more watered down than what you and I drink.
Right.
But it was beer that they would drink instead of what we would consider a more standard drink of water, because there were greater concerns about bacterial infection, and just plain water was not as safe to drink as the water that you and I have going through all kinds of purification processes and all of that.
Right.
So beer, through its natural fermentation and the alcohol in there, is going to kill a lot of bacteria, and it was considered a much more standard drink in their time for basic hydration.
Safer drink.
Yeah, for basic hydration, and that's what they would use. So when I read that TaZ, at least what I assume he means is not, I've got to get my beer fix, my little fun drink to have.
Right. They're not going for happy hours every day after work.
Right.
Necessarily. They could have been, actually. We don't know.
That too.
He didn't say that. So, okay, it's very important, as Rabbi Goldschmiedt points out. I don't know exactly the material realities that he was dealing with and exactly, what they were drinking on an everyday basis. But I will point out, this is not the only comment of beer by Rabbi David HaLevi Segal. And in fact, he writes about it many times throughout his commentary, and commentary just on the section of Yoreh De'ah. But I want to just point out for just a few examples, and really, I will be honest, Rabbi David HaLevi Segal's writings on beer deserve and merit their own separate episode. But for our purposes, let me just mention just a few of them. So I have one in Orach Chaim in 272.6, for those keeping score at home, for Jews in his country in Poland making Kiddush on beer on the day of Shabbat, on Shabbat day, since wine was expensive. And what he said was that, look, everybody makes Kiddush Friday nights on wine. That's what Jews do. That's great. But only the rich, the wealthy people had the money for wine also on Shabbat day, but everybody just made Kiddush on beer. That's what everybody does. That's just a known thing in Polish Jewry. So that's in his time. That's just what we do. For him. 17th century Polish Jews. Okay. Now I have two comments elsewhere in Yoreh De'ah.
And there's a statement in the Talmud also. There's a certain rabbi, I forget what his name is, where
Rav Papa.
It might not be. Somebody asks, it's part of a long string of sections in the Talmud where they ask rabbis,
106a.
what did you merit, what do you think is going to especially give you merit based on how you've conducted yourself in your life?
Yeah.
And one of them says, I was always particular to make Kiddush over wine.
Uh-huh.
And one time my mother even sold her belt so that I can have wine for Kiddush. For you and I, we read that, we're like, what's going on with this guy?
Right.
But again, they lived in a world where wine was much more expensive, much more difficult to obtain.
It was a very different material reality, especially the Babylonian Talmud in Persia, and Sasanian Persia, where beer was the drink of the land and not wine. And it sounds also for Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, beer was the drink of the land of Poland and not so much wine. They could get wine, but it was pricey. Okay, so I have two other I want to point out from Yoreh De'ah, which is the same work that we're actually quoting from for the primary text of our conversation. 114.3 about drinking beer from both Gentiles and Jews, specifically in towns where Jews are not careful about avoiding Gentile wine, which is an interesting leniency that he provides against the Talmud. And then finally, Yoreh De'ah 182.1 about Jews commonly drinking beer within their meal. And then fun fact, they would commonly drink beer within their meals, but then after the meal, they wouldn't drink beer, it would be mead. Mead is what I know you were all wondering. What did the Jews drink after their meals in 17th century Poland? The answer is mead. It's like dessert. It's I don't know if it's necessarily so sweet.
Mead is made from honey.
It's honey, yeah.
Right,
it's fermented honey. So it's probably 2-3 times the alcohol volume of beer. So it's a little bit, you're going to feel good after your meals. That's just a little piece here that, this is not the exclusive mention of beer within the comments of Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, even just within his comments here in the Turei Zahav on Yoreh De'ah. So that's a little bit of a context. He wasn't necessarily hedonistic. It was just, beer is what they had. Beer is what they had. Right. They drank it Shabbat lunch for Kiddush. They had it at meals. It was all around. And that really actually buttresses, really supports what he has to say about it's really the life of people. It's a life of humanity. It's a really important staple, not just of consumption by eating, but consumption by drinking as well, which is, obviously why we're discussing it. But guess what? He's not done. This may be the crux of his argument, but he continues. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show. After he talks about this crux of it, he goes into another further discussion, but he then brings up a really fascinating piece of argumentation, because he says, look, us Jews in Poland, we're living up on a certain latitude. We have a certain climate that we have that is not like the land of Israel, nor even for that matter like Rabbi Cairo when he wrote his Shulhan Arukh. And obviously his predecessor, the century prior in the same land of Poland, Rabbi Ezra was writing that there are certain reasons that they don't do their things. He says, look, we're in colder climates than necessarily those who are closer to the equator. He doesn't use that language, but that's the way we would talk about that. He says, look, it's not the same. You know, when we talk about harvesting things, planting things, taking root, okay, fine. You want to be closer to the equator, you can do that earlier in the year. We're in Poland. That's not the way that planting works.
Right, meaning in our circumstances where we have to plant within cycles that will run more afoul of the Hadash laws, for us, it's a real shat hadachak. It is that pressing circumstance. In other places, they're growing where this issue doesn't really come up as often. But he's saying the local dynamics that we have to deal with, I mean, for us, it very much is a pressing circumstance that calls out for a heter, for a leniency.
Mm-hmm. He says, look, in the lands in which we live, Poland, surrounding countries, the cold that is around us and the weather we have, it goes on past Passover. Okay, you're in Turkey, you're in Israel, that's wonderful, Shalom Yisrael, but us, we're in Poland. Like, this isn't something that we can handle. The way, grains only take root. It's not like they had silos for like years and years, like, probably we have in America, but in Poland in the 17th century, we literally rely on these grains. And it's funny, like, he literally could say, like, we eat these grains. This is what we use for baking, for bread, for pasta, for X, Y, Z. No, he literally mentions beer. And yes, this is Polish brewed beer. Fun little prop. But it's fascinating that this is specifically the argumentation that he uses. So he's not done. He's not even done yet. So even though he pretty much finishes off with that is like pretty, like, you can feel the passion behind these words. Like, beer is so important. I don't know why he's not saying, we need our pasta, we need our bread. These grains are so important. It's like literally built off beer. I mean, it's so, he's not done. He's not done. He actually goes in and he uses, I've not seen this before. This is, I don't know. I'm not widely read. I'm not a huge reader. I haven't said a lot. But he actually, this is really fascinating. He says, look, turns out my father-in-law, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, who wrote The New House by Hadash, he says, look, my father-in-law said he found a responsum. He found a teshuva, and it was in the Hagaz Rishal, in the quoting Me'il Tzedek, quoting Rabbeinu Avigdor Katz, a fellow Kohen, in the name of Teshuas Riva. Like this, it's a whole incredible long string. I'm not used to that. It's saying Shein Chadash Noeg B'Shel of Dei Chochavim. This is the whole issue of these grains and they're taking root. That's good for Jews, but guess what? Gentiles? That's not a thing. Like, it's not.
To clarify, meaning grain grown on Gentile land.
Right.
Right.
It's not that Gentiles can't have Hadash, right? Thank you for that clarification. That when Gentiles grow this grain, that's not. Then it takes it out of our consideration, right? If Gentiles can grow whatever grain, it can take root whenever. That's wonderful. It's also really fascinating that, I don't know about you. I mean, Rabbi Goldschmiedt. I mean, you've probably seen a lot more Teshuvah literature, a lot more of these writings. I mean, how often do we see this huge string of quoting? I mean, that's not typical, right?
I think it reflects the extent to which the Bach was, so to speak, the Bayit Hadash, was looking for a leniency. He was looking for a leniency because he sees the world around him, again, including great scholars who you would think should know better, consuming what might be considered Hadash. Must be that it's not for some reason. So,
right.
To a greater degree than usual, looking for a limud zechut, looking for a way to attribute merit to these people, and not to assume they're doing the wrong thing.
I will point out, one thing I did omit was mentioning, so his father-in-law also went on a different line of argumentation permitting this Hadash, these new grains. Clearly, the son-in-law, Rabbi David HaLevi Segal, is not content with his father-in-law's argumentation.
I think he talks about it at the beginning, right?
He mentioned at the beginning, he tossed it aside, but then he at least mentions this piece. So we now have these different operational factors. That maybe this Talmudic dispute factors in that it really is only within the land of Israel, and another thing, which is even if a Gentile grows this grain, guess what? That's not our concern. It's only for Jews growing grains. That really is the concern. So with these factors, he really seems quite content as good ammunition in his argument, saying, obviously, it's really unclear whether this is only within the land of Israel beyond. Two, maybe this is only grain grown by Jews, not by Gentiles. Gentile grains are outside of the parameters of consideration. And then finally, as sort of like a big oomph, he says, look, life of man is beer, and therefore this is our big sort of punch through permissibility, right?
I mean, that's the reason why you can rely on these other cases where in other circumstances we would really consider that grasping at straws. That's not mainstream halakha to just, we'll do away with Shulhan Arukh. We don't usually take that lightly. Right. So the ability to do so, the TaZ will tell you, is because we're in very difficult circumstances. Now, again,
well, he's not coming out of nowhere. He's literally not coming out of left field. Because we have Rabbi Ezra in the previous century, in the previous generation, his father-in-law, and then him. He's not coming out of the blue. Clearly in Poland, it was something that they maybe could not just totally abide by sort of more closer to the equator rabbinic rulings.
And this is really why you will see, I think it to some degree explains the trend why there are certain people that are being more particular about Hadash than in the past. A lot of the things we just mentioned are dated rationales, right? Again, keep in mind, the Ramah said it's about layers of doubt that you can pile on to one another. Mm-hmm. We don't really have that doubt. We can't choose to remain blissfully ignorant in today's day and age. Back then they could. The information wasn't available even if they wanted it. Mm-hmm. But we can get that information if we wanted to get a sense of what grains are new, what grains are old. Yeah. And then furthermore, I don't think we have the TaZ's dynamic of we got to have our beer, so to speak, or any grain product for that matter.
Right.
It is much more possible to find Yashan alternatives. Mm-hmm. You could even nowadays certainly stock up on food, before that date where things get less safe. So those are various reasons why, not having the grounds for leniency is a greater consideration than in the past. Mm-hmm. The Chafetz Chaim in his Mishnah Brura commentary, he famously says, his problem with this all is that, you have what to rely on with respect to lenient views when it comes to Hadash and Yashan. But it shouldn't be treated like an all or nothing game. He says that's how people relate to it. I don't care about Hadash, that's fine. He says, listen, certain products, if you can find, relatively easily Yashan alternatives, or you can manage with these foods that are Yashan as opposed to having these that are Hadash, try as best as you can. Don't make it an all or nothing game. And he thinks that's an advisable thing to do, even though lenient opinions exist in his time.
Does he talk about it by Pesach?
Mishnah Brura. Where does he discuss this sort of thing? I don't remember. He definitely discusses it somewhere. Huh. But I would, if I had to guess, I would guess it's around the time, around where he talks about the laws of Sfirat HaOmer, which corresponds to that Omer offering that is of major relevance to the laws of Hadash.
Very neat. Well, Rabbi Goldschmiedt, this is really great. This is really wonderful. Thank you so much for this conversation. And is there anything you'd like to promote, share? let people know about?
Not really. I try to not live too much of an online life, so I think most of your listeners...
Rabbi Goldschmidt's busy enough as it is between a whole bunch of kids, literally a handful of kids, as well as a shul with both rabbis, academics, and more. So, Rabbi Goldschmiedt, thank you so much, and l'chaim.
L'chaim.
L'chaim. Woo.